A millionaire CEO falls in love with his secretary after a blind date that reveals more than he expected. Mom, for the last time, I don't need you to be the matchmaker. Cameron Hughes held the phone tightly as he walked through his office at Hughes & Associates, one of Boston's leading financial consultancies. The reflection in the window glass showed a man in his 40s, brown hair slightly graying at the temples and tired blue eyes behind discreetly framed glasses. Cameron Alexander Hughes, you're going to this dinner even if it's the last thing I do. Beverly Hughes' voice sounded determined on the other end of the line. The restaurant is the Mistral, at 8. And don't you dare give me a cake. He sighed, wiping his hand across his face. Since their divorce 3 years ago, his mother had turned his love life into a personal mission. All right, I'll be there. He hung up before she could add any more conditions to the agreement. Her gaze wandered through the glass door of her office, landing on her secretary, Penelope Clark. She was engrossed in her work, as always, her nimble fingers dancing over the keyboard as she coordinated her chaotic schedule with an efficiency he had long since stopped questioning. Penelope, he called through the intercom, I need to reschedule the 8 o'clock meeting. Already done, Mr. Hughes, she replied promptly. I realized you were on the phone with your mother and, knowing the pattern, I assumed it was another arranged meeting. I've moved the meeting to tomorrow at 9. Cameron blinked, surprised at her insight. In 3 years of working together, Penelope had always seemed to anticipate his professional needs, but this personal observation caught him off guard. For the first time, he really observed her. Reddish-brown hair tied up in an elegant bun, delicate reading glasses framing attentive green eyes, and a posture that emanated competence. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and conference calls. At 7:45, Cameron adjusted his navy blue tie in the executive bathroom mirror, resigned to his fate. Mistral, one of Boston's most prestigious French restaurants, was located in a historic building in the South End. As he entered the elegant room lit by crystal chandeliers, he was greeted by the maitre d'. Mr. Hughes, your escort has arrived. This way, please. Cameron followed the man through the tables, mentally rehearsing polite excuses to end the evening as quickly as possible. Then he stopped abruptly. Sitting at the table, wearing an elegant black dress and with her hair loose in soft waves, was Penelope Clark. Penelope? The surprise in her voice was palpable. She blushed slightly, but kept her composure. Mr. Hughes, I mean Cameron, your mother is a friend of my Aunt Margaret. Did you know? He asked, sitting down. Not until an hour ago, she admitted, taking a sip of water. My aunt called me at the last minute. Apparently, she and your mother set this up weeks ago. The initial awkward silence was broken by the sommelier, and soon they were discussing wines rather than circumstances. The familiarity of years of working together helped ease the tension, and the conversation flowed naturally into matters beyond the office. So, Cameron began, after the first course, what do you do when you're not managing my professional life? An enigmatic smile appeared on Penelope's lips. Actually, I write. Really? What kind of writing? Novels. She hesitated for a moment. Under the pseudonym P.R. Bennett. Cameron almost choked on his wine. P.R. Bennett was one of the best-selling authors of the moment, famous for her romance stories set in the corporate world. Are you P.R. Bennett? The books my sister can't stop talking about? Guilty as charged, admitted Penelope, her eyes twinkling with amusement. And some of the stories may or may not have been inspired by certain situations in the office. Wait, that workaholic CEO from Parts and Spreadsheets is me? Maybe with a few creative liberties, she smiled, and Cameron realized he'd never noticed how her smile lit up her whole face. The evening progressed, and each new revelation made him wonder how he had worked alongside this woman for so long without really knowing her. Penelope was intelligent, funny, and surprisingly shrewd in her observations about people. Why keep the books a secret? He asked, as they shared a chocolate dessert. At first, it was fear of not being taken seriously at work, she explained. Then it became a way of keeping the two worlds separate. Besides, she added with a mischievous glint in her eyes, it's easier to watch people when they don't know you're paying attention. Cameron realized he was smiling more than he had in months. You're full of surprises, Penelope Clark. Life would be pretty boring without a few mysteries, don't you think? When they left the restaurant, the fall evening was surprisingly pleasant. Cameron offered his jacket when he noticed Penelope shivering slightly in the breeze. "You know," he said, as they walked towards the parking lot, "I think I owe my mother an apology." "And I to my aunt," agreed Penelope. "Although I suggest we don't tell them too soon. We'll never hear the end of it." Stopping next to her car, Cameron realized that he didn't want the evening to end. "Penelope, tomorrow at 9, she interrupted him gently. "You have a rescheduled meeting, right?" He nodded, understanding that she was setting professional boundaries. "But maybe another time." "Maybe," she smiled, handing back his jacket. "Good night, Mr. Hughes." As he watched her go, Cameron realized that his efficient secretary had just added another mystery to his life and, for the first time in a long time, he was anxious to find out where it would lead. The next morning, Cameron arrived at the office earlier than usual, his Starbucks coffee in one hand and a freshly bought copy of Parts in Spreadsheets in the other. He had spent half the night reading Penelope's novel, recognizing with amazement various elements of his own work environment cleverly disguised in the narrative. The protagonist, an executive called Alexander Morgan, shared many of her characteristics, although Penelope had been kind enough to soften some of his more difficult traits. The heroine, a financial analyst called Rose, was definitely not based on Penelope, which, for some reason, made him curiously relieved. "Good morning, Mr. Hughes." Penelope's familiar voice surprised him out of his thoughts. She was as impeccable as ever, wearing a light gray ensemble that made her look even more professional than the night before. There was no sign of the woman who had shared stories and laughter with him over dinner. "Penelope," he hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. "About last night." "Your first meeting is in 15 minutes, she interrupted him gently, handing him a folder. "The quarterly report is up to date, and I've marked the points that need your special attention." Cameron realized the subliminal message. Here, they were boss and secretary, nothing more. "Thanks, Penelope." He went into his office, leaving the book strategically hidden in his drawer. The morning went on in its usual routine of meetings and phone calls, but Cameron found himself watching Penelope through the glass of his office. Little details that he had never noticed before now jumped out at him. How she bit her lower lip slightly when she concentrated, the way her fingers drummed silently on the table as she thought, probably mentally composing her next stories. During lunch, resisting the urge to invite her to join him, Cameron took refuge in a coffee shop near the office. As he flipped through a few more pages of the novel, his phone vibrated with a message from his mother. "How was dinner, darling? Isn't she lovely?" Cameron smiled, typing a diplomatic reply. "It was amazing." Beverly Hughes, the eternal matchmaker, a familiar voice made him look up. Penelope was standing by his table, holding a vegetarian sandwich. "Can I join you?" "Of course," he replied, quickly putting the book away. "No need to hide it," she smiled, taking a seat. "Actually, I'm curious to know your honest opinion." Revealing, he admitted. "I never imagined that our working environment could be so romantic." "The beauty of fiction lies in seeing the extraordinary in the ordinary," she replied, her green eyes sparkling. "Besides, you'd be surprised how many romances happen in corporate environments. Like the one between Lisa from accounting and Michael from HR?" Penelope arched an eyebrow, impressed. "So you notice more than meets the eye." "I learned from the best observer I know," he replied, making her blush slightly. Lunch passed quickly between conversations about books, characters, and office situations that had inspired their stories. Cameron discovered that Penelope had a sharp sense of humor and an impressive acumen for capturing the nuances of human relationships. "Why haven't we talked like this before?" he asked when they were on their way back to the office. "Maybe because you never took the time to notice that I was more than someone who organizes your schedule," she replied without rancor. But her words hit him hard. Back at the office, Cameron found himself torn between his professional role and a growing curiosity about the woman who had worked alongside him for so long. Every interaction over the intercom now carried a new meaning. Every exchange of glances had an added layer of understanding. At the end of the day, when most of the staff had left, Cameron found a post-it note on his desk in elegant handwriting that he recognized immediately. Chapter 15. When he finally realizes. Intrigued, he opened the book to the chapter indicated and began to read. It was a scene where the protagonist finally saw beyond the professional facade of a secondary character, discovering a depth that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. Still here? Penelope appeared at the door, her bag already on her shoulder. Ready to leave? Just finishing up a few things, he replied, watching her with new interest. Penelope, would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow night? No interference from our families this time. She studied him for a moment, as if assessing his sincerity. Would that be appropriate, Mr. Hughes? Probably not, he admitted, but I think it's about time I met the real Penelope Clark, not just the efficient secretary or the talented PR Bennett. A small smile played on her lips. Tomorrow at 7, she replied, and this time, I get to choose the restaurant. As he watched her go, Cameron realized that he was looking forward to discovering more chapters of this story that had only just begun, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't mind not being in complete control of the situation. The morning after his second meeting with Penelope, Cameron arrived at the office carrying a copy of Corporate Encounters, the latest novel by Pierre Bennett. He had spent the previous night devouring its pages, looking for clues about the real Penelope between the lines of her narrative. Dinner the night before had been a revelation. Penelope had taken him to a small Italian restaurant in the North End, hidden between cobbled alleyways and historic facades. Away from the corporate environment, she had proved even more fascinating, sharing stories about her creative process and the inspirations behind her characters. Mr. Hughes. Penelope's voice brought him back to the present. She was standing outside his office, tablet in hand. The marketing team is waiting in the conference room. Cameron noticed how she maintained impeccable professionalism in the office, as if their dinners had never taken place. It was an interesting dance by day, the efficient Miss Clark, by night, the intriguing Penelope. During the meeting, he found himself observing her discreet gestures as she took notes. Her hands moved gracefully over the tablet, and he wondered if she was really documenting the meeting or secretly developing a new plot for her next novel. Any additional comments, Mr. Hughes? The marketing director's question caught him off guard. No, I think you've covered all the essential points, he replied, grateful for his ability to maintain professional composure even when distracted. After the meeting, he found a new post-it note on his desk. Sometimes the best stories are the ones that happen right under your nose. The message made his heart race slightly. During lunch, he received a text message from his mother. How are things with Penelope? Have you arranged another date? Before he could reply, a new message arrived. Margaret told me she's Pierre Bennett. Why didn't you tell me? Cameron sighed, realizing that Penelope's secret wasn't so secret anymore. He decided to alert her and found her in the small office pantry. Apparently, our families are exchanging information, he commented, as she prepared her tea. I figured that would happen, Penelope replied with a resigned smile. My aunt has never been good at keeping secrets, especially from her best friend. Does that bother you, that they know about your books? She considered the question for a moment. Actually, it's a relief. Keeping secrets can be exhausting, especially from those you love. The sincerity in her voice touched him. How long have you been writing? Since forever, she replied, her eyes shining with passion. But I started publishing 5 years ago, right after I started working here. This environment, she gestured towards the office, is an inexhaustible source of stories. And I never realized it. Cameron shook his head, amazed at his own lack of observation. You were busy being the protagonist, she joked. But there was an underlying truth in her words that made him think. That afternoon, Cameron found himself rereading excerpts from Penelope's novels, recognizing situations and people under new eyes. Each secondary character now seemed like a piece of a larger puzzle, revealing her talent for observing and capturing the essence of the people around her. At 5:30, as the office began to empty, he called her into his office. Penelope, I've been thinking, perhaps we should establish some guidelines, considering our current situation. She sat down, maintaining her professional posture. What kind of guidelines? Well, technically, I'm your boss, And while I'm genuinely interested in getting to know the amazing person you are outside of this office, don't want to compromise your position here." A soft smile appeared on his lips. "I've thought about that too. In fact, I've already written about similar situations." "In which book?" "I haven't published it yet," she admitted, blushing slightly. "Sometimes real life trumps fiction." The moment was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Rebecca from accounting with some urgent reports. Penelope quickly resumed her professional persona, excusing herself from the room. Later, when Cameron was about to leave, she found another post-it note in her briefcase. Chapter 7 of Dilemmas of the Heart. Sometimes the rules are there to be rewritten. At home, he located the book mentioned in his growing collection of P.R. Bennett's works. The chapter in question was about an executive who discovered that his own self-imposed rules and limitations were preventing him from finding happiness. His phone vibrated with a message from Penelope. "Sometimes the best characters are those who surprise us with their capacity for change." Cameron smiled, typing his reply. "And sometimes the best writers are those who make us see ourselves with new eyes." Lying in his bed that night, Cameron realized he was living his own corporate romance story. The irony didn't escape him. He, who had always prized control and professionalism, now found himself completely involved in a plot that could have come straight from the pages of Penelope's books. And for the first time in his life, he was eager to discover the next chapter, even if he didn't know exactly how the story would end. The news of P.R. Bennett's identity spread through the office like fire through dry straw. Cameron noticed the curious glances directed at Penelope as she maintained her usual routine, seemingly oblivious to the commotion her revelation had caused. "Ms. Clark," Rebecca from accounting approached Penelope over breakfast. "Is it true that The Price of Love was inspired by the secret romance between the former CFO and the sales manager?" Cameron watched through the glass of her office as Penelope handled the situation with characteristic grace. "Fiction is a complex mixture of imagination and observation, Rebecca. Any resemblance to reality is mere coincidence." Later that morning, during a video conference with investors, Cameron found himself admiring the way Penelope masterfully conducted presentations, wondering how many of these interactions had found their way onto the pages of her novels. "Mr. Hughes," her voice brought him back to reality. "The third quarter reports need your signature." As she approached his desk to hand over the documents, Cameron noticed a small black notebook in her hand. "Your next bestseller?" he asked quietly. An enigmatic smile crossed his lips. "Maybe. Or just notes on a certain absent-minded CEO during important meetings." The comment caught him off guard, making him laugh. "Touché, Miss Clark." During lunch, Cameron received an unexpected message from his younger brother, Marcus. "So, my workaholic brother is dating P.R. Bennett? Mom won't stop talking about it." Before he could reply, Penelope appeared at his door. "Sorry to interrupt, but I thought you should know Business Weekly magazine wants to do a story on the secretary who became a best-selling author." Cameron frowned. "How did they find out?" "Apparently, someone in the marketing department leaked the information," she sighed, sitting down in the chair opposite her desk. "I didn't want it to affect the working environment." "You don't have to accept the interview," he offered. "In fact," she adjusted her glasses, a gesture he now recognized as a sign of nervousness, "my publisher thinks it would be great publicity for the next book. What do you want to do?" "Honestly, I'd prefer to keep my professional life separate from my literary one, but it looks like that ship has sailed." Cameron stood up, walking around the table to sit in the chair next to her. "Penelope, you've built 2 impressive careers on your own. Don't let anyone diminish that." She looked at him in surprise. "You've really changed your perspective on me, haven't you?" "Let's just say I'm finally reading between the lines," he replied, making her smile. In the afternoon, during a board meeting, Cameron noticed how differently the other executives treated Penelope. Professional respect was now mixed with barely concealed curiosity, and some even tried to make references to her books. After the meeting, he found her in the scullery, preparing her usual afternoon tea. "How are you coping with all this?" "It's strange," she admitted, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "For years, I kept these 2 lives separate. P.R. Bennett was my outlet, my way of processing everything I observed here. Now, it's as if the worlds are colliding. Do you regret it?" Writing? Never. Letting people know? I'm still deciding. She paused, looking directly at him. And what about you? Do you regret finding out? I only regret not realizing earlier how extraordinary you are, he replied sincerely. The moment was interrupted by her phone ringing her editor about the magazine interview. Later, when the office was almost empty, Cameron found a new post-it note on his desk. Sometimes secrets protect us, sometimes they imprison us. Chapter 3, Masks of the Heart, he smiled, recognizing the reference to his third novel, which he had just started reading. In the book, the protagonist struggled with the burden of keeping up appearances in the corporate environment while hiding her true passion. Her phone buzzed with a message from Penelope. Dinner? We need to discuss how to deal with this whole situation. Sure. Same place as yesterday? Actually, she replied, how about my apartment? I promised to make a better lasagna than the one at the Italian restaurant. The proposal surprised and pleased him in equal measure. I accept. Shall I bring the wine? A Chianti would be perfect. And bring your thoughts on Masks of the Heart. I'm curious to know what you think of Chapter 7. Cameron put away his laptop, realizing that he was looking forward not only to dinner, but to the opportunity to get to know another side of Penelope, the woman behind the stories that now consumed his nights. As he left the office, he reflected on how his life had changed dramatically in just a few days. From a CEO focused only on numbers and results, he now found himself immersed in a story that could easily have come out of P.R. Bennett's novels, except that this one was real, with consequences that went beyond the pages of a book. And for the first time in his career, financial reports weren't the last thing on his mind before bed. The aroma of homemade lasagna filled Penelope's cozy Beacon Hill apartment, a charming duplex with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Cameron watched in fascination as she navigated the kitchen with the same efficiency she demonstrated in the office, although here there was a lightness to her movements that he rarely saw in the corporate environment. So, this is P.R. Bennett's headquarters, he commented, his eyes roaming over the colored post-its scattered across one wall, each containing story ideas and snippets of dialogue. My creative process is a bit chaotic, Penelope admitted, taking the lasagna out of the oven. She had swapped her executive ensemble for jeans and a loose blouse, her hair tied up in a casual ponytail. Different from the methodical organization I maintain at work. It's fascinating to see these two sides of you, Cameron commented, opening the Chianti he had brought, the efficient Ms. Clark and the creative P.R. Bennett. And which one intrigues you more? She asked, a teasing glint in her green eyes. The Penelope in between, he answered honestly, making her blush. Over dinner, they talked about the impending interview with Business Weekly. Penelope expressed her concerns about how it could affect her professional credibility. I'm afraid that people will start looking for themselves in my books, that the atmosphere in the office will change. It already has, Cameron observed, but not necessarily for the worse. You've earned even more respect. Respect? She arched an eyebrow. Rebecca from accounting spent all morning trying to find out if she appears in any of my books. Does she? Maybe in Love in Numbers, Penelope admitted with a mischievous smile. But she'll never know which character. After dinner, they moved into the living room, where an entire wall was dedicated to first editions of his novels, each one carefully preserved. Cameron noticed a manuscript in process on the coffee table. Is that the next one? He asked, curious. Penelope hesitated before answering. Different from the others. More personal. What do you mean? Normally, I write about characters watching others fall in love. This one is about someone living the love story. The implicit meaning of his words hung between them. Cameron took a sip of wine, processing the information. And how is that story developing? It's still being written, she replied softly, her eyes meeting his. The moment was interrupted by the ringing of Cameron's cell phone, an urgent email from the London office. As he quickly answered, Penelope got up to make coffee. Sorry about that, he said, putting the phone away. Old habits. You know you appear in all my books, don't you? She commented casually from the kitchen. One way or another, there was always something about you that intrigued me, even when you barely noticed me beyond the daily chores. The honesty of the confession caught him off guard. Was I that absorbed? Let's just say you'd make an excellent case study on successful workaholics. she joked, returning with 2 cups of coffee. What about now? What kind of character have I become? Penelope considered the question for a moment. Someone in development? A man discovering that there's more to life than spreadsheets and meetings. Thanks to a certain secret writer, he smiled, approaching her on the sofa. Cameron, she began, her voice serious. We need to talk about the office, about how we're going to deal with this. She gestured between them. Are you worried about what people will think? I'm worried about mixing up my worlds even more. It's complicated enough being P.R. Bennett and Penelope Clark. Add a relationship with my boss into the equation. Who said anything about a relationship? He teased, causing her to pat his arm. I'm serious, she insisted, but there was a smile on her lips. Me too, replied Cameron, becoming serious. Penelope, you're much more than an efficient secretary or a talented writer. You're someone who made me see the world and myself in a completely new way. She studied him for a moment, as if memorizing every detail of his expression for a future character. You know what's funny? I spent years writing about moments like this, but living it is completely different. Better or worse than fiction? Scarier, she admitted. In books, I always know how the story is going to end. Cameron took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. Sometimes the best stories are the ones you can't predict. The rest of the evening passed in a mixture of conversations about books, work, and future dreams. When Cameron finally said goodbye, it was after midnight. About tomorrow at the office, he began. I know, she smiled. We'll go back to being Mr. Hughes and Miss Clark. For now. For now, he agreed, leaning over to kiss her cheek gently. Good night, P.R. Bennett. Good night, protagonist, she replied, closing the door with a smile. On the way home, Cameron realized that, for the first time in his life, he was living a story that not even P.R. Bennett could have imagined, and he couldn't wait to discover the next chapter. The interview for Business Weekly was scheduled for that morning, and the Hughes and Associates office was buzzing with a different energy than usual. Cameron watched through the glass of his office as Penelope dealt with the situation, maintaining her characteristic composure while a photographer adjusted the lighting near her desk. Ms. Clark, the voice of the journalist, Amanda Foster, echoed down the corridor. What's it like balancing a corporate career with literary success? Cameron resisted the urge to interfere when he noticed the slight discomfort in Penelope's eyes. She had confided the night before, during a late-night phone call, that she felt like an animal on display. It's an exercise in compartmentalization, Penelope replied diplomatically. Each role requires a different set of skills. The professional response made Cameron smile. Even in the spotlight, she maintained the control she admired so much. His phone vibrated with a message from her. Help? He immediately left his office. Miss Foster, sorry to interrupt, but we have an important video conference with investors in 5 minutes. Can we continue this over lunch? The journalist nodded, although her perceptive gaze alternated between Cameron and Penelope, as if detecting something else in the interaction. Of course, Mr. Hughes. In fact, it would be great to include your perspective on working with a best-selling novelist. After the magazine team left, Penelope let out a sigh of relief. Thank you for intervening. Always at your service, P.R. Bennett, he murmured, making her blush slightly. Mr. Hughes, interrupted Rebecca, approaching with a stack of documents. About those reports? The rest of the morning passed in a familiar dance of meetings and phone calls, but there was a new dimension to every interaction between them. Little glances exchanged during presentations, discreet smiles in the corridors, ciphered messages that only they understood. Over lunch with the journalist in the elegant restaurant of the Four Seasons Hotel, Cameron watched in fascination as Penelope skillfully navigated between her different personas. She talked about her novels with restrained passion, but kept a professional distance when discussing the corporate environment. What about the inspiration for your characters? Asked Amanda, her sharp gaze fixed on Cameron. Especially the workaholic CEO of Hearts and Spreadsheets? Fiction is a complex tapestry, replied Penelope softly. Each character is a composite of different observations and imagination. Interesting, the journalist noted. What about romance in the workplace? Will your next story deal with that? Cameron almost choked on his coffee, while Penelope maintained her admirable composure. My books explore various dynamics of human relationships in the corporate context. Each story arises naturally from your own observations. Back at the office, they encountered a small commotion. Someone had organized an impromptu book club to discuss P.R. Bennett's novels. "This is getting out of hand," muttered Penelope, observing a group of employees animatedly debating which character would be based on whom. "Maybe it's time to embrace your fame," suggested Cameron, although he understood her hesitation. The line between their different lives was becoming increasingly blurred. At the end of the day, when the office had emptied, Penelope entered Cameron's office with a worried expression. "The publisher wants to bring forward the release of the next book to take advantage of the publicity." "What does that mean?" "It means I need to finish the last 3 chapters in 2 weeks, she sighed, sitting down. "And with all this attention at the office, use my house." The words came out before he could think. "I have an office that I rarely use, it's quiet, and no one will interrupt you there." Penelope stared at him in surprise. "Would that be appropriate?" "Probably not," he admitted, remembering their conversation the night before. "But you need a space to write, and I need to make up for years of being a distracted boss." A soft smile played on his lips. "What about the comments in the office?" "Let them talk," he replied, surprising himself with his nonchalance. "You said yourself that the best stories are those that defy expectations." That evening, as Cameron watched Penelope settle into her Beacon Hill home office, surrounded by colorful post-its and a cup of tea, he realized how much his life had changed in such a short time. Her presence transformed the austere environment into something more alive, more real. "What is it?" she asked, noticing his gaze. "Just thinking you could write a book about it," he replied with a smile. "Who says I'm not already?" She smiled back, turning her attention to her laptop. Cameron let her work, retiring to his living room with one of her novels. As he read, he could hear the soft sound of her typing, creating new worlds and stories just a few meters away. It was a new dynamic for both of them, professional and personal, reality and fiction, all blending into something neither of them had planned, but which seemed inexorably right. His phone vibrated with a message from his mother. "I saw the picture of you two on the Business Weekly website. When were you planning to tell me about the relationship?" Cameron glanced at the office, where Penelope was engrossed in her writing, and smiled. Some stories, he realized, are better lived than told, even if they eventually become a bestseller. The cover of Business Weekly hit the newsstands on a Thursday morning. In the main photo, Penelope was sitting at her desk in the office, with Cameron in the background, both captured in a moment of natural interaction that, to the more attentive eye, revealed much more than a simple professional relationship. From Office to Fiction, The Double Life of P.R. Bennett, Cameron read the title aloud in his office, where Penelope had taken refuge after being bombarded with questions from curious colleagues. "The story was interesting," she commented, nervously adjusting her glasses, "especially the part where the journalist suggests that there is a palpable chemistry between us." "Well, she wasn't entirely wrong," Cameron replied with a half-smile, making Penelope blush. The phone on his desk rang. It was Sandra from Human Resources. "Mr. Hughes, the board requests an urgent meeting about compliance issues." Cameron and Penelope exchanged worried glances. The company's policy on relationships in the workplace had always been clear, especially involving superiors and subordinates. "I'll be there in 5 minutes," he replied, hanging up. "Penelope, it'll be fine," she assured him, although her voice trembled slightly. "We're professional adults." The boardroom was tense when Cameron entered. Robert Maxwell, chairman of the board and Cameron's mentor for years, got straight to the point. "Cameron, I assume you've seen the story." "Yes, I did, Robert. And before you start, I want to make it clear that you're romantically involved with your secretary, who coincidentally is one of the best-selling authors of the moment," interrupted Janet Walsh, legal director. "The situation is more complex than that." Cameron defended himself, keeping his composure. "Penelope is an exceptional professional who has written several books based on our company," Robert added. "Books which, I must admit, I read last night. Surprisingly accurate in their observations of the corporate world." Cameron blinked, surprised. "You've read her books?" "My wife's a fan," Robert shrugged. "The point is, Cameron, we have a delicate situation here. an employee using the workplace as inspiration for best-selling novels, and now a possible relationship with her direct superior. I suggest an immediate transfer of Ms. Clark to another department, proposed Janet. No, the firmness in Cameron's voice surprised everyone. Penelope is crucial to my department's operations. If anyone should be transferred, it's me. A heavy silence fell over the room. Robert studied Cameron for a long moment before speaking. You really care about her, don't you? More than I thought possible, Cameron admitted. Back in his office, he found Penelope organizing files with almost frantic efficiency, her way of dealing with anxiety. How was it? She asked, without taking her eyes off the documents. Interesting, he replied, closing the door. Apparently, Robert is married to a fan of yours. That made her stop. What? And he thinks your books are surprisingly accurate. A small smile appeared on her lips. That's because he never found out that the character of the golf-obsessed vice president in Love in Numbers is based on him. Cameron couldn't hold back a laugh. Penelope Clark, you're full of surprises. And you? She asked, finally facing him. Are you sorry about all this? Discovering that my brilliant secretary is actually a shrewd observer who has turned our corporate routine into romance? Or realizing that I'm completely in love with her? The words came out before he could stop them, surprising them both. Penelope dropped the folder she was holding, scattering papers on the floor. Are you? She began, but was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Rebecca again. Mr. Hughes, sorry to interrupt, but the West Coast investors are on the line. The moment was broken, and Penelope quickly bent down to pick up the documents, her hands shaking slightly. Cameron took the call, but his eyes didn't leave her figure. Later that day, as the office began to empty, he found a new post-it on her desk. Some stories are better lived than written. Dinner tonight? He smiled, replying with a message. My apartment? I promise not to mess up your deadline. The reply came quickly. I'll bring the wine this time, and maybe a few pages of the new book for you to proofread. As he put his belongings away, Cameron reflected on how his life had changed over the last few weeks. From an executive focused solely on results, he now saw himself as the main character in a story that not even P.R. Bennett could have predicted. And for the first time in his career, he was perfectly fine with not being in total control of the narrative. The Business Weekly story had set off a wave of events that neither of them was fully prepared to face. The morning after Cameron's unplanned confession, Penelope found her inbox flooded with interview requests and invitations to literary events. Your publisher called 3 times this morning, Rebecca informed her, practically skipping over to Penelope's desk. And there's a bouquet of flowers waiting in reception. Cameron watched the scene from his office, noticing how Penelope maintained her professional composure even when clearly uncomfortable with the attention. The bouquet, he knew, was hers, white roses with a card that read simply, "Some statements deserve a chapter of their own. Mr. Hughes," Penelope's voice sounded over the intercom, "the legal department has sent over the new confidentiality agreements for review." It was her way of keeping up appearances in the office, even after the night before, when they had shared not only dinner, but also confidences and hesitant kisses between revisions of her manuscript. "Bring it in, Miss Clark," he replied, maintaining the professional tone that now sounded like an elaborate performance for a very attentive audience. As she entered his office, Cameron noticed the subtle dark circles under her eyes. "Didn't you sleep well?" "I finished 3 chapters last night," she admitted, placing the documents on her desk. "After you left, the inspiration just flowed." "Something to do with a certain unplanned statement?" he teased, lowering his voice. A faint blush tinged his cheeks. Maybe some moments in real life are more inspiring than fiction. Before they could continue their conversation, Robert Maxwell appeared at the door. "Cameron, Penelope, can I steal a moment from you?" They exchanged worried glances before following Robert to his office on the executive floor. To both their surprise, Janet Walsh from the legal department was also present, along with a woman Penelope recognized immediately, Margaret Winters, her literary agent. "Maggie?" Penelope asked, confused. "What's going on?" "Sit down, please." Robert gestured to the chairs. "We've been discussing an interesting proposal. The publicity generated by the Business Weekly story has created a unique opportunity," Margaret explained. Several publishers have shown interest in a specific series on the corporate world with its insider perspective, and Hughes and Associates is willing to negotiate the image rights and intellectual property, added Janet. As long as we have some editorial control over the content. Cameron felt Penelope tense beside him. Does that mean censorship? It means collaboration, Robert corrected. Your books already perfectly capture the essence of the corporate environment without compromising sensitive information. We want to make that official. What about our situation? Cameron asked, choosing his words carefully. That's why I'm here. Janet opened a folder. We've drawn up a restructuring proposal. Penelope would be promoted to Director of Corporate Communications, reporting directly to the board. This eliminates any conflict of interest in your relationship. The silence that followed was heavy with possibilities. Penelope looked at Cameron, who nodded slightly, encouragingly. Can I think about it? She finally asked. Of course, replied Robert, but don't take too long. The press are already speculating about your next work. Back in Cameron's office, Penelope began pacing back and forth, a habit he now recognized as his thought process. It's a great opportunity, he commented softly. It's a huge change, she stopped, turning to him. Not just professionally, but us. It would all become very public. Cameron stood up, moving closer to her. Penelope, you've turned everyday observations into stories that touch thousands of people. Maybe it's time to live your own story openly. What if it doesn't work out? The vulnerability in her voice touched him deeply. Then we'll have material for another book, he joked, making her laugh despite the tension. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls, but the proposal hung over them like a cloud full of possibilities. Over lunch, hidden away in a discreet cafe a few blocks from the office, they finally talked about it openly. You know what's ironic? Penelope commented, absent-mindedly stirring her coffee. I've spent years observing and writing about people falling in love in the corporate environment, and now you're the protagonist of your own corporate love story, Cameron added, taking her hand across the table. A story that began with a blind date arranged by our families, she smiled, entwining her fingers in his. Speaking of which, my mother keeps texting me wanting to know when we're going to make it official. So does my Aunt Margaret. Apparently, they're already planning a family dinner. Penelope's cell phone vibrated. It was her publisher again. The book's deadline has been extended by another week, considering the exceptional circumstances. How's the ending? Asked Cameron, genuinely curious. A mysterious smile appeared on her lips. It's still being written, but something tells me it will be better than anything I could have imagined. The news of Penelope's promotion leaked out before the official announcement, generating an even bigger buzz in the corridors of Hughes and Associates. Cameron watched with a mixture of pride and concern as she navigated the turbulent waters of transition, maintaining her characteristic dignity even in the face of prying eyes and whispered comments. So the secretary turned executive? She heard someone comment in the pantry. I wonder how she got that promotion. Actually, Cameron intervened, causing the group to quickly disperse. She got it on her own merits. Something you'd know if you'd paid attention to the exceptional work she's been doing for years. Penelope, who was organizing her new office on the executive floor, found a post-it note on her desk with Cameron's familiar handwriting. Some stories deserve to be defended. The physical change of office symbolized more than just a promotion. It was the materialization of the transformation in their professional and personal dynamic. No longer secretary and boss, but partners in different aspects of life. How's the new chapter? Asked Cameron over a discreet lunch in her office as she typed furiously on her laptop. Complicated, admitted Penelope, adjusting her glasses. It's different writing about love in a corporate environment when you're living it. The line between fiction and reality gets hazy. Maybe it's time to let reality trump fiction, he suggested, making her smile. The afternoon brought an unexpected surprise. Beverly Hughes, Cameron's mother, showed up at the office unannounced, accompanied by Penelope's Aunt Margaret. Mom? Cameron almost choked on his coffee. What are you doing here? We've come to see for ourselves how our little arrangement has developed, Beverly replied, exchanging complicit smiles with Margaret. Besides, we need to discuss the engagement dinner. Engagement? Penelope and Cameron exclaimed in unison. "Oh, come on. Don't give me that look," Beverly gestured dismissively. "After that picture in Business Weekly, it's clear that you're in love. And Margaret told me about the new book." "What new book?" Cameron looked at Penelope, who blushed intensely. "Maggie," Penelope scolded her aunt. "It was supposed to be a surprise." "Darling, with all due respect to your creative process," Margaret smiled. "But when your publisher read the draft of the new novel clearly inspired by your history with Cameron, she practically begged to bring it forward." The silence that followed was interrupted by Cameron's phone, an urgent video conference with investors in San Francisco. As he excused himself to answer it, the three women headed to a nearby cafe for a conversation that, Penelope suspected, would significantly change the course of their lives. "So," Beverly began as soon as they were seated, "when were you planning to tell us about the apartment?" Penelope nearly knocked over her chai latte. "How?" "Darling, I've been a novelist for decades," Margaret interjected. "I know a developing story when I see one. Besides, the doorman in Cameron's building is a big fan of your books." "It's not what you think," Penelope tried to explain. "I only use his office to write when I need peace and quiet." "What about the clothes in the guest closet?" Beverly arched an eyebrow. "They're for emergencies," Penelope sighed, surrendering. "Sometimes I lose track of time writing and end up sleeping there," Margaret added, her eyes twinkling. "Just like the protagonist of your new book." Back at the office, Penelope found Cameron waiting in her new office. "How was the conversation?" "Surreal," she replied, dropping into her chair. "Apparently, we're more transparent than we thought." "About that new book?" he began, but was interrupted by knocks on the door. It was Janet Walsh with the final contracts for the promotion. "Everything in order?" asked Janet, handing over the documents. Penelope signed without hesitation, surprising herself with her certainty. As Janet left, Cameron approached her desk. "Are you sure about this? About all this?" "For the first time in my life," she replied, getting up to face him. "I'm writing a story that I don't have to imagine the ending to." Cameron smiled, pulling her into a kiss that definitely violated several long-standing corporate policies. Through the glass walls, they could hear sighs and some discreet applause from the employees. "I think we've just given you more material for gossip," Penelope murmured against his lips. "Or for your next bestseller," he replied, making her laugh. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings, calls, and preparations for his official transition. In the evening, in her apartment which, yes, had become more and more theirs, Penelope finally showed Cameron the manuscript of the new book. "Love Between the Lines," he read the provisional title. "The story of a secret writer who falls in love with the man who inspires her novels." "Too obvious?" she asked nervously. "Very perfect," he replied, pulling her into his arms. "Although I still think reality is better than fiction." "In that," she smiled, "you're absolutely right." 6 months after Penelope's promotion, Hughes and Associates had been transformed. Her new position as Director of Corporate Communications brought a fresh perspective to the company, and her romance with Cameron, now public, had become something of a corporate legend. "The new book has been at the top of the bestseller list for 3 weeks," commented Rebecca, placing a copy of Love Between the Lines on Penelope's desk. "And everyone is trying to figure out which parts are real." Penelope smiled, looking at the cover of the book that had changed her life. The story of a secret writer and a workaholic executive had captured the public's imagination in a way that even she hadn't expected. "Ready for tonight's event?" Cameron asked, entering her office. The official launch of the book would be held in Boston's largest bookstore, combined with another special announcement. "Nervous," she admitted, unconsciously adjusting the engagement ring on her finger, a gift from 2 weeks ago, when Cameron surprised her with a proposal during a late-night writing session in their shared apartment. The day passed quickly between meetings and preparations. By the evening, the bookstore was packed a mix of PR Bennett fans, Hughes and Associates colleagues, and family. Beverly Hughes and Aunt Margaret were in the front row, practically bursting with pride. "Ladies and gentlemen," the bookstore owner began, "it is with great pleasure that we present PR Bennett, whereas many now know her, Penelope Clark, for the official launch of Love Between the Lines." The applause was warm as Penelope took to the small stage, Cameron watching proudly from the sidelines. She had blossomed in recent months, finding a perfect balance between her different personas. "This book is unlike anything I've ever written," she began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "Because for the first time, I didn't have to imagine what it would be like to find love in a corporate environment. I was living it." All eyes turned to Cameron, who smiled, accepting her role in this true story. During the book signing that followed, Penelope alternated between signing as PR Bennett and Penelope Clark Hughes, her future name, after the wedding scheduled for the following spring. "You know what's funny?" she commented later, when they were alone in her apartment. "I've spent years watching other people live their love stories, and now you're the protagonist of your own story," Cameron added, pulling her into his arms. "Our story," she corrected, smiling, "and we still have many chapters to go." Her phone rang. Her publisher was ecstatic with the initial sales and was already talking about a film adaptation. Cameron watched as she navigated this new phase with the same grace she showed in everything she did. "They want to make a movie," she announced after hanging up. "Apparently, our story has touched more people than we imagined." "Well, it's not every day that a secret secretary writer falls in love with her absent-minded boss," he joked. "And it's not every day that a workaholic CEO discovers that his efficient secretary is actually the author of his favorite novels," she quipped. As they prepared dinner together, a new routine they both loved, they discussed the next steps: the wedding, the book adaptation, future projects at Hughes and Associates. "Are you still going to write corporate novels now that you're an executive?" he asked. "Of course," she replied, chopping vegetables. "Only now I have a different perspective and a very special private consultant." His smile was warm. "Always at your service, PR Bennett." The next day, back at the office, they found an excited buzz. News of the film adaptation had leaked out, and speculation about who would play whom was already running wild in the corridors. "They say they're going to shoot some scenes here," commented Rebecca, practically jumping up and down with excitement. Penelope and Cameron exchanged amused glances. Their story, which had begun in those very corridors, would now come to life on screen. It was surreal and perfectly appropriate at the same time. On her desk, Penelope found a new post-it note from Cameron. "Some endings are just new beginnings." She smiled, tucking the note into her drawer along with all the others they had exchanged over the months, little chapters of her real story, more precious than any novel she could write. And so, between corporate meetings and late-night writing sessions, between wedding plans and movie adaptations, between the reality and fiction that had intertwined so perfectly, Penelope and Cameron continued to write their own story, one that proved that sometimes the best novels are the ones that life writes for us.